There is a map drawn more than 500 years ago that shows something it shouldn't. Not a myth, not a symbol, but a coastline detailed, measured, deliberate, and that coastline looks almost identical to Antarctica. But here's the problem: Antarctica was officially discovered until 1820. This map was created in 1513, more than 300 years earlier. At first, that does sound impossible. Old maps were often inaccurate. Cartographers filled empty spaces with imagination, unknown lands, invented continents. It was common. But this is different because this map does show a vague shape. It shows structure, bays, curves, edges that don't feel imagined. And when modern scientists compared this coastline to the actual land beneath Antarctica's ice, they found something unsettling. It matched. Not the ice, the land below it. Rock formations hidden under kilometers of frozen ice. And that ice has been there for thousands of years, which creates a very simple question. How do you map a coastline that no one should have ever seen? The map was created by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. He didn't claim to discover anything. In fact, he wrote clearly that he was copying from older maps that were already ancient in his time. Some came from Portuguese sailors, others from unknown sources. Which means if this coastline is real, it didn't begin in 1513. It began somewhere else, somewhere earlier. And that is where the story starts to shift. Because we no longer asking who drew this map. We asking who drew the map before it. And how far back that knowledge really goes. This is just about Antarctica. It's about something else entirely. Because if even part of this is real, then history is missing something. Something precise, something technical, something we don't remember having. And that raises a deeper question, not what this map shows, but what we've forgotten how to see here. That's where the timeline begins to break. Because Antarctica, as far as the official record is concerned, did not exist to the human world until the early 19th century. In 1820, 3 separate expeditions led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, Edward Bransfield, and Nathaniel Palmer reported sightings of a vast, frozen landmass at the bottom of the Earth. These accounts are considered the moment Antarctica entered recorded history. Before that, there are no confirmed expeditions, no documented landings, no verified observations, just absence. And yet, when you place that date 1820 next to a map drawn in 1513, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. More than 3 centuries of missing explanation. 300 years where the official story says no one knew what was there, and still a coastline appears. That gap is not just a historical curiosity. It is the central tension of this entire mystery. Because history, as we understand it, depends on sequence. Discovery follows exploration, knowledge follows observation, maps follow contact. But here, the order seems reversed. A map appears before the discovery. Detail appears before access. Knowledge appears before experience. And that inversion forces a different kind of question. Not who discovered Antarctica, but what counts as discovery in the first place. Because if a coastline can be drawn before anyone officially sees it, then what we call discovery might not be the beginning of knowledge. It might simply be the moment that knowledge is recognized or rediscovered by a system that records it. And once you consider that possibility, the timeline begins to feel less stable. Because there are only a few ways to explain this. Either the coastline on that map is a coincidence, a shape that only appears accurate when we look at it through modern data, or it is an interpretation error patterns imposed onto ambiguous lines by a mind that wants to see meaning, or, and this is where it becomes uncomfortable, it is information that existed before the moment we believe it should have existed. Information that somehow survived long enough to be copied, preserved, and passed forward without a clear origin. The official explanation leans heavily toward coincidence and interpretation. And to be fair, those are powerful forces. Humans are exceptionally good at finding patterns, especially when the data is incomplete. We connect dots that were never meant to connect. We impose structure on randomness. It is a cognitive instinct, not a flaw. But the difficulty here is not that coincidence is impossible. It is that coincidence, in this case, has to carry a very specific weight. It has to explain not just a rough resemblance, but a coastline with curves and features that seem to align with something real. It has to explain why that alignment appears before any verified contact. And it has to do so without leaving behind a clear technical account of how that alignment emerged from error alone. That is where the tension stays. Because the more you look at the timeline, the less it behaves like a straight line. It starts to resemble something else, something fragmented, something where pieces of knowledge appear, disappear, and reappear again without continuity, as if what we call history is not a complete record, but a surviving layer, a thin slice of something much larger that has been lost, erased, or simply never written down in a way that endured. And if that's true, then the year 1820 stops being a beginning. It becomes a re-entry point, a moment where something already known, in some form, crosses back into the official narrative, which leads to a harder question. Not how Antarctica was discovered, but whether it had been known, at least in part, long before anyone was supposed to know it. And just when the timeline starts to feel unstable, another layer appears, because the idea of a southern continent didn't begin with maps. It began with a theory. More than 2,000 years ago, philosophers like Aristotle and Pythagoras argued that the Earth had to be balanced. A sphere, they believed, could not exist with all its land concentrated in the north. There had to be something in the south, a counterweight, a hidden landmass. Aristotle even gave it a name, Antarctos, opposite of the Arctic. It sounds impressive, almost prophetic. But there's a problem with that explanation, because theory can suggest existence, but it cannot produce detail. Geometry can predict balance. It cannot draw coastlines. It cannot describe bays, peninsulas, or the subtle curves of a real continent. And yet centuries later, that is exactly what begins to appear. Not just a southern land, but a specific one, with structure, with features that look less like speculation and more like memory. That shift from idea to detail is where the real tension begins. Because if the Greeks were only guessing, then everything that followed should remain vague, abstract, symbolic. But it sharpens, it becomes more precise over time, as if something is being refined, not invented. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the Greeks were not starting from zero? What if their theories were not pure speculation, but echoes of something older? We know that many Greek scholars traveled to Egypt, to Babylon, to places where knowledge was preserved in ways we don't fully understand. Pythagoras himself is said to have studied in Egypt for years, learning from priesthoods that claimed access to records far older than their own civilization. Records that described events thousands of years before their present. That idea is usually dismissed, filed away as myth, exaggeration. But here's the difficulty. When you place that possibility next to the maps, it begins to form a pattern, a theory about a southern land, followed by maps that seem to describe it, followed by modern data that partially confirms it. Theory map confirmation, but out of order, as if the middle step didn't originate where we think it did, as if the knowledge didn't flow forward but survived in fragments, passed down, copied, reinterpreted, without anyone fully understanding what they were holding. And that would explain something else. Why these maps appear in different places, different cultures, different centuries, and yet they seem to share the same underlying idea. Not perfectly, not clearly, but consistently enough to feel connected. Because if this were just imagination, it would vary wildly. But it does it converges. And convergence is not what you expect from randomness. It's what you expect from a shared source. Something deeper, something older, something that left traces but not a clear record. And that leads to a much more difficult question. Not whether the Greeks were right, but why they were right. And whether their answer came from somewhere I've completely forgotten. And just when the idea starts to feel like coincidence, another map appears, and then another, and then another. Because the Périérès map is not alone. In 1531, a French mathematician named Orontius Phineas produced a world map that shows something even more unsettling. Not just a southern continent, but one with detail. Rivers, mountain ranges, a coastline that looks strangely familiar. And unlike Périérès, this wasn't a fragment. This was a full representation, Antarctica drawn, as if someone had seen it, explored it, understood it. But again, there's a problem. This was drawn nearly 300 years before Antarctica was officially discovered, and it doesn't stop there. In 1737, another map appears, created by a French royal cartographer named Philippe Bouache. His version shows something even more specific. Antarctica divided into two separate landmasses, split by an internal body of water. At the time, this was dismissed as imagination, a mistake, a creative guess. But in 1958, seismic surveys revealed something unexpected. Beneath the ice, Antarctica is not one solid continent. It is two major landmasses connected by a central ridge, exactly as Buak had drawn it more than 200 years earlier. Now stop for a moment and consider what that means. One map might be coincidence, two maps might be shared error, but three maps across different countries, across 2 centuries, all pointing toward the same hidden structure, that S where coincidence starts to feel crowded. Because these weren't isolated thinkers. The Ottoman Empire, Renaissance France, European scholars. These were not connected systems, sharing information freely. They didn't collaborate. They didn't exchange cartographic secrets. And yet somehow they converge, not perfectly, but consistently enough to raise a different kind of question. What if they weren't inventing these maps? What if they were copying something? Because that S exactly what Piri Reis claimed. He didn't say he discovered anything. He said he compiled his map from older sources, some ancient, some unknown, which means the real origin of this information is not in the 16th century, it's earlier, possibly much earlier. And that shifts the entire frame of the mystery. Because now we not looking at a few strange maps. We looking at fragments. Fragments of something that may have existed before them. Passed down, redrawn. Preserved just enough to survive, but not enough to explain itself. And that creates a deeper tension. Because if these maps are copies, then somewhere in the past there must have been an original, and that original would have required something very specific. Not theory, not imagination, but observation, measurement, exploration, the kind of knowledge we don't believe existed at that time. And that leads to the most uncomfortable question so far, not whether these maps are accurate, but whether they are evidence. And this is where the mystery stops being historical and becomes physical, because everything we've discussed so far, maps, theories, timelines, can still be explained away as coincidence, interpretation, or even error. But the moment you bring in the ice, the rules change. Antarctica is not just a continent. It is a continent buried under ice, ice that in many places is kilometers thick. Ice that has been there for thousands, sometimes millions of years. Which means the land beneath it has not been visible for a very long time. And yet, when scientists began mapping that hidden terrain in the 20th century, they found something unexpected. Using seismic surveys, researchers were able to map the shape of the rock beneath the ice sheet. Not what Antarctica looks like today, but what it looks like underneath. The true coastline, the buried structure. And when those results were compared to the southern edge of the Piri Reis map, something didn't line up the way it should. Because the map didn't match the ice, it matched the land beneath it, the subglacial terrain, the actual shape of the continent hidden under layers of frozen time. That comparison was studied by Charles Hapgood, who argued that the level of similarity could not be explained by coincidence alone. His claim was controversial. It still is. Critics pointed out projection errors, misinterpretation, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. And those criticisms are valid. They deserve to be taken seriously, because the brain is incredibly good at finding connections even when they aren't there. But here is the difficulty. Even if you account for projection error, even if you assume some level of exaggeration, the question does to disappear. It just becomes sharper, because now you have to explain not just a vague resemblance but specific alignment, features that seem to correspond to real geological structures, curves that mirror coastlines buried under ice, and that forces a very simple constraint. For a map to match subglacial terrain, that terrain must have been visible at some point. Ice does not reveal what it covers. It conceals it, which means either the match is an illusion or the information comes from a time before the ice covered it. And that brings us to another uncomfortable detail. Antarctica has not always been frozen in the way it is today. Ike's core data suggests that parts of the continent experienced significantly warmer conditions within the last 10,000 years. Not completely ice-free, but not entirely frozen either. Coastal regions in particular may have had exposed land, meltwater, even flowing systems. Now think about that timeline for a moment. Around 10,000 years ago, according to the standard historical model, human civilization was just beginning. Early agriculture, early settlements, no advanced navigation, no global exploration, and certainly no expeditions to the bottom of the world. And yet if the land was partially visible, then mapping it would not have been impossible, just unexpected. Which leaves us with two competing explanations. Either the similarities between these maps and subglacial terrain are the result of coincidence, amplified by interpretation, or they are traces of knowledge from a time when Antarctica looked different. And that's where the tension holds. Because both explanations are possible, but neither one closes the question cleanly. One relies on pattern recognition pushed to its limit. The other requires us to accept that knowledge can exist before the systems that are supposed to produce it. And somewhere between those two possibilities is where this mystery actually lives. At this point, there is an obvious reaction, and it's an important one. Because everything you've seen so far, maps, timelines, even the ice, can still be challenged. In fact, they should be. The strongest argument against this entire mystery is not that it's impossible, but that it's misleading, that what looks like accuracy is actually interpretation. Because old maps are not precise in the way modern maps are. They distort, they stretch, they compress geography in ways that can accidentally resemble real shapes. And when you take a distorted map and compare it to a modern projection, you can create matches that were never intended. This is known as projection error, and it's real. Add to that something else. The human brain is exceptionally good at finding patterns, especially in ambiguous data. Show someone a vague coastline and a modern map, and they will start to align features. A curve becomes a bay, a line becomes a peninsula. Not because it was drawn that way, but because the mind wants it to be true. This is called confirmation bias, and it is powerful, strong enough to make coincidence look like design. So the skeptical position is clear. These maps do not prove anything, they are artifacts of their time, filled with imagination, convention, and error. And when we compare them to modern data, we are imposing meaning onto shapes that were never meant to carry it. As a clean explanation, rational, grounded, and in many ways convincing. But here's where the problem returns. Because that explanation works well until you start isolating details. Not the general shape, not the broad outline, but the specific features. Certain curves, certain alignments, certain structural relationships that don't behave like random distortions. And that's where the argument becomes more difficult. Because coincidence works best at scale. It can explain general resemblance. It struggles with specificity. And this is where researchers like Charles Hapgood focused their attention. Not on the whole map, but on particular features. The Antarctic Peninsula, the Drake Passage, sections of coastline that appear in places they shouldn't, with shapes that resemble something real. Hapgood's conclusions were controversial. Many experts rejected them. Some dismissed them entirely. But even critics often focused on his broader theories like crustal displacement, rather than fully dismantling the specific cartographic comparisons he made. And that leaves a gap. Not a proof, but a gap. Because if the similarities are exaggerated, they should be easy to disprove precisely. Not generally. Not by saying maps are inaccurate, but by showing exactly how those specific features emerge from error. And that explanation is harder to find. Which creates a strange situation where both sides hold something valid. The skeptic is right to question interpretation. The evidence is not clean enough to demand a single conclusion. But at the same time, the details are not weak enough to ignore. And that tension is what keeps the question open. Because this is not a mystery built on belief. It's built on conflict between what we expect to see and what appears anyway. Between randomness and structure. Between explanation and residue. And that residue is the part that does to go away. Even when the argument feels settled. Even when the explanation sounds complete. There is still something left behind. Something that doesn't fully dissolve, and that is where the mystery stays. Not in the obvious, but in what remains after everything obvious has been explained. And this is the point where I stop looking at the maps and start looking at the gaps. Because the maps themselves are not the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is what's missing. Piri Reis was very clear about one thing. He did not create his map from nothing. He compiled it. From older charts, Some from Portuguese sailors, some, he said, from much older sources. Sources he did not fully identify. And that detail changes everything. Because if the information on that map is unusual, then its origin is even more so. It pushes the problem backward, away from the Renaissance into a space where the record becomes thin, fragmented, incomplete. And this is where I find the standard explanation starts to feel insufficient, not wrong, just incomplete. Because coincidence can explain a shape, it can explain a resemblance, but it doesn't explain inheritance. It doesn't explain why someone in 1513 would be copying material that already contained these features. That implies continuity, a chain of knowledge, and that's where things become harder to ignore. Because knowledge does to usually survive without structure. It needs institutions, libraries, traditions of preservation. But when you look for those structures here, they aren't obvious. There is no clear archive, no known collection of ancient global maps that could account for this. Just fragments, references, hints that something existed without leaving behind a complete trace. And I'll be honest, this is the point where I become cautious. Because it's very easy from here to jump to conclusions, to fill the gap with a story, a lost civilization, a hidden archive, a forgotten technology. And those ideas are tempting. They give shape to the unknown. They make the mystery feel resolved. But I don't think resolution is what we actually have. I think what we have is a boundary, a place where the evidence stops being clear and starts becoming suggestive. And in that space, you have to hold two possibilities at once. The first is simple, that all of this, every map, every alignment, every detail is the result of layered coincidence and human interpretation. That there is no deeper source, no hidden knowledge, just patterns emerging from noise. And that explanation is entirely possible. It requires no missing pieces. The second possibility is more difficult. That some form of knowledge existed before the systems we use to define history. That it was recorded, preserved, and then lost except for fragments. Fragments that were copied without full understanding, passed forward without context, until they appeared, centuries later, in places where they no longer made sense. I don't claim that this second explanation is true, but I do think it explains something the first one struggles with, the persistence of structure, the way certain ideas, certain shapes, certain details continue to reappear across time, across cultures, without a clear point of origin. That does to feel like randomness. It feels like residue, and residue usually means something was there before, something that left a trace even after it disappeared. And that S where this stops being a question about maps. Because the real question isn't T who drew them, S what were they copying? And that question is much harder to answer. Because whatever the source was, it didn't survive. Not in a way we can point to. Not in a way we can verify. Only in pieces. Only in echoes. And maybe that S the part that matters most. Not whether the knowledge was complete, but that it existed long enough to leave something behind. Something subtle. Something easy to dismiss, but difficult to fully explain away. And once you see it that way, the maps stop being anomalies. They start to look like fragments of a larger picture, a picture we don't have anymore, but might still be partially visible. And this is where the story changes again, because, up to this point, we've been asking a very specific question. How could ancient maps show something that shouldn't have been known? But that question might actually be too small. Because the deeper issue is to the map. It is the assumption behind it, the assumption that knowledge always moves forward, that history is a straight line, that we know more now than anyone who came before us, that once something is discovered it cannot be lost. But that assumption doesn't hold up very well when you look closely. Entire cities have disappeared beneath oceans. Civilizations have collapsed so completely that for centuries we didn't even know they existed. Languages have vanished without leaving behind a single readable trace. Knowledge doesn't just grow. Sometimes it breaks, sometimes it fragments. Sometimes it survives only in pieces that no longer make sense to the people who inherit them. And if that is true, then the maps we've been looking at don't need to be perfect to matter. They don't need to prove anything conclusively. They only need to suggest something important, that the story of human knowledge might not be complete. That what we call the beginning of civilization might not actually be the beginning. Just the earliest part we can still see clearly. And that changes how you look at everything. Because instead of asking, how did they know this, you start asking, what else might they have known that we no longer recognize? Not advanced technology in the way we imagine it. Not science fiction, but precise knowledge, observations, measurements, things that could be recorded and then misunderstood by the generations that followed. And suddenly, the mystery isn't about Antarctica anymore. It's about continuity, about whether knowledge can survive collapse, and if it does, what form it takes when it reappears. Because maybe it doesn't come back as a complete system. Maybe it comes back as fragments, as symbols, as maps that look almost right but not fully understood. And if even one of those fragments turns out to reflect something real, then the implications are quiet but profound. It means we've been looking at history the wrong way, not as a complete record, but as a surviving layer. And there are layers beneath it we haven't fully uncovered, or maybe never will. And I'm not asking you to accept that conclusion. I am asking you to sit with the question, because that's where the real value is, not in proving a theory, but in recognizing the limits of what we know and how easily those limits can feel invisible. So here is something to think about. If a map can survive for 500 years copied from sources that no longer exist, carrying details that still don't have a clear explanation, then what else might still be sitting quietly in archives, in libraries, in fragments of texts we've already read without realizing what we were looking at? And that's where I'll leave this. Not with an answer, but with a choice. You can see this as coincidence, as pattern seeking, as a story built from connections that don't actually exist. Or you can see it as a signal, a small one, incomplete but real enough to deserve attention. And if you made it this far, I am curious what you think. Do these maps show coincidence or something we've forgotten? Let me know in the comments. And if you're interested in exploring more mysteries like this, where history doesn't quite behave the way we expect, subscribe. Because this is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And there is one last detail I can't ignore. It is small, easy to miss, but once you notice it, it changes the tone of everything we've talked about. The Piraeus map was not hidden. It wasn't buried in some secret vault or lost forever. It was sitting in a library in Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, quietly preserved for centuries, rediscovered in 1929 during a cataloging process. It had been there the entire time, not suppressed, not erased, just unexamined, and that detail matters, because it suggests something very different from what people usually imagine when they hear a mystery like this. There is no need for conspiracies, no need for hidden organizations or lost secrets being deliberately protected. The map was always there. The question was always there. We just didn't know how to look at it, or maybe we didn't think we needed to. And that's the part that stays with me. Not the idea that something was hidden, but that something could exist in plain sight and still go unnoticed for centuries. Because that changes the nature of the mystery completely. It means the unknown is always buried. Sometimes it's simply unrecognized. And if that's true, then this story does end with Antarctica. It expands outward, because now you have to ask a different kind of question. Not what secrets are being kept from us, but what are we already looking at without understanding what it is? Old maps, ancient texts, fragments of knowledge that survived without context. We tend to treat them as artifacts, as relics, as incomplete attempts to understand the world. But what if some of them aren't incomplete? What if they precise but disconnected from the framework that would allow us to recognize that precision? And that's a harder problem, because it doesn't mean the knowledge is gone. It means it's still here, just not readable in the way we expect. And that idea creates a strange kind of loop, because if knowledge can be lost without disappearing, then rediscovery doesn't always look like discovery. Sometimes it looks like recognition, like realizing that something we had for a long time was more important than we thought. And that brings us back to the map. Not as proof, not as conclusion, but as a signal. Something that doesn't quite fit, but doesn't go away either. And maybe that's what makes this different from most mysteries. It does resolve. It does collapse into a simple answer. It stays open. The more you look at it, the more it resists being reduced. And that resistance is information. Because real questions don't disappear when you examine them. They deepen, they expand, they create new questions behind them. And this one does exactly that. So here's something to take with you. If even a single fragment of knowledge can survive for centuries, detached from its origin, misunderstood, and still remain accurate in ways we can fully explain, then what else might still be waiting in the background of history, not hidden, not protected, just unnoticed? And if you made it this far, you're already doing something. Most people don't, you're looking closely. And that's where these kinds of questions begin to matter. Because once you start seeing patterns like this, it becomes harder to assume that what we know is the full picture. And in the next video, we're going to follow that idea further. Because there are other places, other structures where history seems to arrive too late, and explanation comes after the fact. If you thought this map was unusual, the next one is harder to explain.